need a black thing. Because it's red, right? Is that black? think it is.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Flourish Painters class. We will get started in about 3 minutes. Hey guys, I'm just testing my mic. Can you give me a little hand in the air if you can hear me right now? All right, thank you. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jen Korolenko, and I will be your instructor today for this session of Flourish Painters. And today we're going to be doing succulents. So we've got 3 different ones that we're going to do, obviously on a larger scale. Just in case you're new here, we will go through the way the class works and what supplies you'll have in front of you today. So obviously you're going to need a pan of watercolors and some brushes of varying sizes. We're using rounded pointed tip brushes of varying sizes today. We'll also use a pen toward the end of class to add some details. So any pen with black ink will do. I'm using a Sharpie pen just because I like them. You can use an art pen or a simple black ballpoint pen as well. Just black ink is what you will need. And I've got a pan of semi-moist watercolor paints here with my palette built into the lid, which I'll be using to mix colors on. I've also got 2 cups of water, 1 clean and 1 for washing my brushes to the side. 2 cups here. And then you're also going to need some trusty paper towel because we are going to be blotting quite a bit. Of course, you are going to need watercolor paper, and the watercolor paper that I am using today pardon me, is the Canson 140-pound cold pressed paper. Cold pressed and hot pressed paper only differentiated, obviously, because one is pressed cold and one is pressed hot, but basically it's a texture thing. The texture on the paper is different when it's pressed cold or hot. 140-pound paper is really nice and thick, so it's nice and absorbent for our purposes. This is a nice budget answer to a good quality watercolor paper. And then one thing, I am teaching from my office this afternoon, so my computer is behind me. So I can't see any of your names or beautiful photographs or any of that. I'm going to reserve a few minutes for the end of class to answer any questions that may come up. during the course of the class. You can feel free to write any of those questions in the chat, and I will answer them to the best of my ability toward the end of class. And the last and final thing I think I need to cover before we get painting is that if you would like a recording of this class, please contact Ms. Abby Roy from Flourish, and she will get the recording shared to you. That is the way we are handling that situation. And without any further ado, we're going to get started painting some succulents. So when we think of succulents, we think of cacti, obviously, I do personally, but also the kind of petal-based succulent. We're going to do one of those, and we're going to do a couple of traditional cacti, and we'll make them flowering because we can, and we can make our own choices. So we're going to add those for a little pop of color, so we're not using exclusively green this afternoon. So I am going to mix up some greens to start, because we always want to get going with our palette first. Select that first. You'll be mixing and altering as we go. And if any of you, if suddenly you can't see what I'm doing or my hand is blocking, please feel free to shout at me and tell me to move it, because again, I can't see my screen. That would be super helpful for me. So I am going to grab, I think, a number 6 brush. This is just a long round brush, and I'm going to just activate some of the watercolor that I mixed up earlier when I was painting. I don't know why I'm losing my voice. That figures. I don't think I've talked to a single person all day. And the moment I have to, there goes my voice. I'm also going to activate this like orangey color I had down in the bottom there, and the hot pink on the opposite side. And I'm going to start to pick up some greens from my palette. Oh, one more thing, if I didn't remind you, please put your view on speaker view as opposed to gallery view. That way you hopefully will see just my screen in like very large. So I've saturated my brush, and I'm going into kind of a nice bright green color, and I'm really scrubbing the pan here. If you watch tons and tons of watercolor videos like I do, you'll notice that everybody's palette gets pretty gross. That's actually a sign you're doing something right. So trying to stay neat and clean is not our concern for this moment. So we've got a nice base green, but it's a little, I don't know, it's a little cartoony for me. So I'm going to go into a brown, scrub my pan and pick up some of that. Go ahead and mix that into this pretty grass green. Okay, let's rinse off our brush. I'm gonna go back into that green because I liked the way it looked. And to this one, I'm going to add some yellow. This is kind of like a lemon yellow color. I'm scrubbing the pan, adding that so we have a nice kind of like a citron green. Now this purple down here, I'm going to add kind of an army green to it, but you add any green you have. I think I mentioned this last week. It's actually easier to select colors when you have a limited palette. So if you have the 8-pan prang colors, I kind of miss using those. I really like this big pan of watercolors for the variety, but it's a little overwhelming. Let's see, what else do I want to mix? Let's add a little bit of this like mustard yellow color to that first green. There we go, that's a little softer. I want to warm up our dark green a little, so I'm just going to add a little bit of this, like make a little bit of mud at the bottom there to create some dimension. Okay. So I'm going to put these guys to the side. And it doesn't matter how you hold your paper. I'm going to do each cacti on its an individual sheet of paper, and then put them aside as we go. You can put them all three on one paper like I had on my example that was up in the beginning. Completely up to you, but I feel like painting a little bit larger this afternoon, so I am going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go grab that same number 6 brush, and I'm going to pick up some of that yellowy green color that I just mixed up. And the first cactus that we're going to do is kind of like the traditional cylindrical looking cactus that I think of anyway when I think of a stereotype. I'm not from the Southwest though, so I'm from New Jersey. So when I think of a cactus, I think of this kind of guy here. So we're going to start off by making a cylinder. Or just like a really rounded oval, like so. And trust me, this guy is going to look kind of like a pickle for a great deal of this tutorial. That's what I was thinking anyway when I was painting my sample earlier. And I'm just going into that nice bright citrusy green and making stripes. I'm going to rinse my brush and then blot it, and then just use some of the water to start to fill in and soften these edges. This paper's thirsty today. Got to work quick. Find that some days more than others, I have to work faster than I normally would. I'm sure it's like a weather thing, like how you can bake bread in some people's houses but not others because of the humidity. I'm sure there's got to be some kind of similar situation with working with things like testy art supplies like watercolor. So we have the main part of our pickle or cactus, and it needs an arm or two. So I am going to go to my left and attach one of these situations. Just like we did before, I'm making it kind of stripey where I'm leaving some white space and rinsing off my brush and blotting it. And I'm kind of just working when I'm looking to blend areas that are not like sopping wet. I'm just working the tip of my brush in teeny tiny circles to blend out areas as I move along. While everything's still wet, I'm going to go into a darker green. I'm going to start dropping that in on the top and the bottom of my cactus. So today we're going to do a combination, just like last week, of wet into wet, wet into dry, and then adding some final design elements with some pen and ink, making our succulents a bit more graphic and illustrative. This is a style that I just find is much more forgiving for the beginner watercolor painter. I think he needs another arm. Maybe he's got like a little guy over there. See, I almost forgot to leave white space. Terrible. And my light went off. And I'm just moving around that pigment with the tip of my brush. Maybe it's darker on one side of the arms than the other. I don't want this floating in air, so I think I'm gonna add some dirt in a bit. But for now, this guy looks lonely, so I'm going to paint him a friend, just like a cylindrical. Not everything is a cylinder, Jennifer. It is a spherical cactus down here. I'm going to use the same kind of technique of leaving some white space for myself. And then using a lighter and a darker color. Maybe he looks like a little snowball. Around there. Leave that. I'm going to continue to add a little bit more dimension. I'm going into like that brownie, that warm brown green color that I mixed up. And I'm just going to let that bloom in a few different areas. Maybe some over here. Surely down on the bottom. And on the bottom of this guy. Put your hand in it like I just did. Or don't. I'm gonna put dirt there anyway, so I'm not gonna worry about it. I'm gonna put some water down on my palette, and speaking of dirt, I'm gonna mix up a little bit of brown. Again, you get that good color saturation by really scrubbing your watercolor pan with your brush, with your wet brush. You hear me scrubbing away off camera here. Okay. And just to imply dirt, I'm gonna make sure they don't touch too much because we're still dealing with the wet surface here, but I don't necessarily want our cacti, now that there are two, floating in space. That bled just a little bit, so that's okay. We can clean that up. I'm going to go into a darker brown color. Just add a little bit of that. I'm not going to worry about cast shadows or anything like that for right now. If you're feeling fancy and you want to add shadows, go for it. And now I'm just using a wet brush that I dipped in water and blotted on my paper towel to encourage this color that I put down further on the paper. I'm just kind of going in a back and forth motion, obviously, to create a little vignette for our first cacti. Okay, now these guys have a good base. We're going to let them dry, and then we're going to come back to them in a bit with some additional details. Obviously, we're going to do that for each one. But the next cacti that we're going to do, I'm just going to rip this paper off and put it to the side, is a really nice, easy one to do because basically it's just a bunch of ball shapes that are stacked up on top of each other, but they tend to be flowering cacti. Well, the photos that I saw online anyway, when I was looking at references, they tend to have those really pretty pinky orangey flowers. So we'll get to do a little bit of detailing with those for the next one. And I'm still gonna just stick with the number 6 brush. And I'm going to stick with these colors that I mixed up earlier, but I'm going to go ahead and add some additional water and play around with them a bit, just so I can change up the tone of my palette. This one was a little bit warmer, meaning that I added yellows and oranges to get the tones of my greens. Now for this one, I think I'm going to make my greens a bit cooler, which means I'm going to add like blues and purples to get that effect. So I am going to scrub the pan of this really pretty, almost like a peacock blue color. Woo, she is teal. I don't know, I think watercolors are great. I get excited every time I get a good color mixed up on my palette, but that is just me, the art nerd. Okay, so got that nice, pretty teal blue. I'm gonna go into a lime green, scrub that, so bright. And I think I wanna mute that a little bit, so I'm just gonna take a little bit of like this warm burnt sienna, mixer in there. I'm liking that a little bit better. The teal is like a little bit too extra for me, so I'm gonna take some white. You can also use a little bit of black to mute the color, or just use water. There we go. Now we've got almost like a Tiffany box blue, but I like that. I'm gonna go ahead and mix that into my darker tone, and also pick up some of this darker green from my palette and add her into the mix. And then just a regular green. More of a grass green up top. I think I'm going to add a little bit of this pretty turquoise to it. Cool it down just a little bit. Okay. So I've got a clean brush that I've blotted. Moving over. I think this guy can be a vertical situation. I'm going to start out again with my lightest green. We're always working light to dark in watercolor, because we could always add, but taking away is a little bit more challenging. And by a little bit, I mean a lot, because you actually can't erase. So here I'm just making a solid sphere. And then I'm going to kind of start to stack them, making sure my brush is nice and wet, because we're going to let a lot of the paint bloom making this particular one. They don't all have to be perfectly round. This is looking like Mickey Mouse. So we're going to have to add a couple of details to her. There we go. It's looking less like a cartoon rodent. And I'm picking up that really pretty turquoisey color. And just letting that bleed into my lighter green. Kind of indiscriminately. Just following my instincts. And so you can really get some good opacity from shades like this. Just rinsing my brush a bit, and I'm gonna grab the darkest green that I mixed up earlier, and I'm gonna let that bleed into the opposite side of some of these shapes that we just created. Just letting our palette work together. Drop in a little bit of color over here. Do a little blotting and a little blending just by using that very, very tip of our pointed brush in the teeniest, most gentle little circles. And I want to let some of the paper come through too in that original color that we put down. Now this guy might have a couple of friends close by as well, so maybe something here. And I just outlined with my grassy green color and then blotted my brush and then filled it in like that. And I'll do that one more time so you can see that kind of technique. So I'm picking up color on my brush. My brush is fully loaded. And I'm gonna go over here and create kind of a squished circle kind of shape like that. I'm gonna blot my brush, dip it in water, and then fill in from there. That's even a little bit too wet, so I'm blotting again. Maybe this guy is something growing there. Dropping in color as we work. Kind of using this opportunity to refine any edges that you're not loving while your paint is nice and wet. I'm just kind of alternating between the greens that we mixed up and creating some texture and really letting the paint do the work for me. I think to add a little bit more interest to this, I'm actually going to pick up some yellow and just scrub my pan of yellow and just drop a little bit of that in a few places. Just to diversify the color here just a bit. So I've got a puddle. You know what we do with puddles. I'm going to grab a piece of my paper towel and twist it. And I'm just going to barely touch it to my paper. It's so absorbent. You can also use this technique to add a little bit of opacity and texture to pieces of your painting that are still quite wet. I'm kind of liking the way that looks. Adding a little texture that way. And then I'm going to create some dirt for this little trio of cacti to be living in as well. I'm going to do a little more of a red kind of toned background. And again, I went in with the color beforehand. Now I'm gonna rinse and blot and then just encourage the color down with the tip of my brush. A little bit more water. This is bleeding just a bit, but that is okay. We can just clean that up as you see it happen. Drop a little bit more of that red in there. Maybe a little bit brown of brown. We're going to come back to these in a few minutes. Again, once they are dry, and continue to add details, both with a little bit more watercolor, and then finally with our pen and ink. Okay. I'm not going to worry about these little smudges that are happening elsewhere in my painting for now, because we are the masters of our own destinies here. So we can trim these paintings however you like them to be. So don't get worried about having drips and drags on your paper unless you're trying to specifically make a painting that's like has to be a 5x7 or an 8x10 or something like that. That's rarely the case. You can get mats cut at any framing or craft store, cut to any size for relatively cheap with a coupon. So if you're liking the way something comes out in particular and you've made a mess like me, don't worry about it. Although I am leaving my brushes in my water, which is bad. Don't do that. That do worry about, because that will ruin your brushes. Okay. To the side. Okay, so the final kind of succulent that we are going to do is going to be kind of one of those leafy, flowery, the ones that look like they're blooming a rose. So this kind, I don't know what they're called specifically. Do individual succulents have names? I'm sure they do. I have a black thumb. I know I kill cacti. These are the only kind of plants that I can have, the ones I paint. My husband, on the other hand, is very good at keeping things alive, not me. So it's the only way I can have greenery in my life. I'm going to go ahead and mix up our palette for this. And again, I think I'm going to make these colors, or at least a couple of them, a little bit on the blue side. Just because that's kind of the mood I'm in. So I've got this pretty minty green color. Sure, why not? I'm just going to activate the citron color I have mixed up already, add some yellow. Again, really scrub, get that color on there. I'm going to add some water and some those two shades of green. I'm going to add just a touch of, what am I going to add? Touch of like an indigo, I think. Yeah, that'll do it. Get a little bit more of a saturated color. More yellow. A little bit of white or just extra water. There we are. I'm going to grab some army green. Really scrub, scrub, scrub those pans. I suppose I should mix up a very dark green. Guess I don't have to, but I will. Let's start with a bluey green color. Add a little grass green. Warm it up with a little orange, which will darken it for us as well. Just a smidge of a really dark brown or a black. All right. Mixed, put aside. Now, this one, unlike the other ones, is not going to be planted in the dirt. We're just going to have it sort of floating in the center of our page. So if you choose to have a background or something, you can go ahead and add that later. But for this one, I'm going to start with a number, I guess we'll stick with the 6. Yeah, why not? We'll force us all to use the tips of our brush. And I'm going to use not the lightest color to start, but one of the other ones. And I'm just going to pick a center point on my paper to be the center of this new succulent. And I'm just going to kind of start painting dashes. And as we go around that initial little grouping of dashes, I'm going to connect some of them. And they're going to start looking like petals as opposed to abstract shapes. Right? Okay, now I find for this particular succulent, it was easy for me to sort of rotate my paper as I go around. That way I'm not dragging my hand through it. So the petals from here, once you have this little, looks like a little cabbage or something, we're going to continue to add to it. And we're going to make little shapes like that. And then kind of connect them like little triangles. But they're just curved a bit. And you don't want them all to be the same size. There's going to be a little bit of irregularity. So I'm doing my little triangles and rotating. We've got this little guy here. Now I'm going to wet my brush and blot. And I'm going to start to fill in these shapes that I just made. Again, we're working quickly for now. We're going to come back to this with more color and with some pen and ink. But it really is amazing the range of tones that you can get just by using one color green. This is all the same color green. So I'm going to drop some into the tips of my petals and maybe near the base. I guess they're more leaves than petals, technically. I'm going to go back into the center area, which by now is starting to dry. Telling you, it's all the recycled air in the MSC. Gotta be. Things don't dry this fast in my house. I am now going to go into a little bit of a darker green. And just add some of that in some areas. I'm even going to fill in some of this white space that I have just hanging out, just with some dashes, just lines. I'm barely touching the paper here, because we want some negative space, but not a ton, because that's going to force us to use much more pen and ink later. I want to like ease you guys into this. Okay. Maybe I go in with my turquoisey color while I'm in the neighborhood here. And add her into the mix where I've got my nice puddles sitting. And while I've got this beautiful color on my brush, I'm going to continue to add those triangular shapes to make the petals, make our succulent a bit bigger. Now, rather than picking up paint from my palette, I'm going to pick it up from a petal that I made just a little bit too puddly. And really just use the tip of that brush to manipulate your shapes as you build them. Maybe some of these overlap. Some of them connect, some of them don't. Taking some darker green now and letting that bleed into my leaves. I'm going to take that same darker green. I'm just adding a little bit of brown to it. And I'm going to continue to fill in some of my white spaces as they emerge. Now this kind of succulent is so fun. You can just keep going and going and building out and out and out as much as you want to, but for our purposes, I want us to get to the finishing touches of the 3 styles. So I'm gonna stop here, but feel free to keep adding on to this particular kind of succulent if you'd like, because again, you can build this out so it fills your whole paper eventually. And that's kind of a cool, almost abstracted, like Georgia O'Keeffe moment. If you wanted to do that, just an idea. Okay, so I'm gonna put her to the side and I'm gonna revisit succulent number 1, which was this guy right here. And I'm not gonna mix up any more greens. I'm just gonna start to play a little bit of jazz here and improvise a bit using the colors that I had just previously mixed for our last succulent. Make sure everything's in frame. I think we're good. In combination with the color straight out of my palette to do a wet on dry technique, because this is, yes, it is dry. So I'm going to wet my brush and blotter, and then I'm going to go into a nice bright green color, and I'm going to sort of just more mindfully start to create like a striped pattern as a layer. of color on top of our cactus. All the lines don't have to be the same thickness, but they can be if you're into that kind of thing. Nature is hardly ever completely predictable in that way, where things are completely symmetrical. I'm going to do the same thing on our little arms here. Just still using a nice bright green color. Just anything that's going to be a contrast to the colors that you already have put down on your paper. A little bit more water and a little blot. Okay, let's just visit our friend over here. We'll maybe get a darker green to make stripes on the sky. Still going to let a little bit of that white show through. Got the darker green, and I'm going to go in between the stripes that I just put down to continue to build on texture. And I'm going to rotate my paper just so it's easier for me to get to. This is the beauty part about watercolors, creating these really light layers of color. And this prevents us from overworking both our paints and our paper. Anyone who has painted a hole into a piece of watercolor paper will understand what I'm talking about. You'll all do it at some point in your watercolor journey, I'm sure. Happens to everybody at some point. Mixing up a bit of a more darker green just because I'm running low. I'm gonna need to blot that. I can already tell because it was really loaded up on that brush. Pick up a little bit of paint. Pick up a little bit of color. And just add some of that to both of the arms. There we are. Just continuing to add additional stripes. Now I'm going to need to refresh our dirt. We kind of have a little bit of an unnatural transition happening down here. And I'm just going to do that by mixing up a little bit of brown. And just kind of sharpening that initial line. Whether you are a fan of hard lines in your watercolor paintings or not is a personal preference. It drives some people nuts, but I kind of like the way the minerals and the pigments sort of settle and create those sharp transitions for you. All right. We are going to put that one aside. Now, I think as opposed to adding additional watercolor to these ones, I think I'm going to go right in with my pen. Oh, I want to add the flowers. We can't forget that part. I'm going to go down to a smaller brush, whatever you got. This is a number 1, which is super small. And I'm picking up some of that hot pink, that pinky color I had hanging out earlier. And whether you want to do this is completely up to you, but I'm going to go to some of the, I found this super skinny long brush. I'm kind of obsessed with it. I'm just doing little upward strokes here in kind of a U shape. We've done this shape a few times before making wildflowers. And I'm just going to give 1 flower to each. This guy's got like a little itty bitty. And those should dry relatively quickly. Okay. To add detail to this particular type of cacti, I'm going to do a combination of 2 things. I'm going to do a combination of dashes and little tiny V's. And what I mean by that is by around the outer edges, I'm going to start to do that situation to create sort of a spiky look. And we're not going to do it everywhere in the interest of time. Maybe some spots just have a few spikes sticking up like that. You can feel free to go around the entire circumference of your succulents. A couple spikes over here. Okay, now that you have a little bit of a base there, now I'm going to add these little V shapes. So just like that. And I'm constantly moving my hand around as I do these, so I don't get too much of a pattern happening, because I don't want anything that's honestly that dependent on being in a perfect pattern. Now the transitions between the balls that are stacked on one another, you can go ahead and do dashes. And again, little V's, changing the direction if I am adding them to a different part of our succulent. Now, if you're a person who needs to concentrate and move slowly, please don't try to keep up with me. I work really quickly. It's been that way ever since I can remember. When I had studio classes in college for painting, my professor used to say, you do 2 paintings and go home. That's how quick I work. So watercolor is a good medium for me because it forces you to work relatively quick, but you do not have to be a speed racer like I am. Work at your own pace. Okay, for the little flowers that we have there, I'm going to add some details to them just by making little petal shapes. I'm going to draw those with my pen on top of the little bit of color that I put down there. Just very, 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 very simple. And just because I went in with the pen doesn't mean that I can't go back and add additional layers of color in spots that are left blank. You can completely go back and do that. Noticing where I didn't complete my pattern. Okay, that's these guys. Of course, you can add some like little squigglies and like kind of rocky shapes, like imply some rocks and things in the dirt. You can do that as well. Next week, we're going to do landscapes. So we will get, we're kind of moving in that direction. So we're going to do landscapes using silhouette. So again, don't get nervous at the idea of doing like a really detailed landscape. It's going to be something really approachable. I'm just returning back to this stripey guy. Now for this one, I really do like to, first of all, just pick a few spots and add those little like pointy guys. I really do like to follow the shape completely with dashes. Completely all the way around. And then also follow some of the lines that I created with little dashes too. So I'm just making these a little bit shorter. I'm following my own roadmap. Okay, and something so simple like that really adds so much. To this kind of cactus. Now, as an alternative, if you're not a person who enjoys the inclusion of pen and ink, you can absolutely go in with additional dry watercolor to create the same kind of effects. If you're looking on this succulent here, you can see I used a mixture of kind of like a gray V shape using a skinny brush and those V shapes that I did with the pen. So you can create the same kind of texture using a really skinny brush and watercolor. I just find that I can work quicker using the pen, and it really adds that graphic element that I personally like in my work. I tend to make watercolor paintings that are more illustrative. If you're a person who's looking for more realism, then obviously exploring other techniques are completely a great idea for you. There are a lot of really good watercolor painters on YouTube and other different platforms. But this is just the technique that I personally use in my practice when I decide to use watercolor as my medium. Not all the time, but most of the time. We all have things that we prefer when it comes to art making and supplies. So you can kind of see I've got this one finished here, making sure I'm showing you up close, that I used the same technique to make a mini version of that succulent, and then just went all the way around the entire shape, and up and down in a few rows to add accents. I even added a flower to it, which you can absolutely do. And finally, before I answer questions, I'm going to show you quickly how to get started on adding detail to this guy before we run out of time. So this I used, I used a technique of shading, which you can use cross-hatching. Cross-hatching is kind of the idea of making shapes like that and then concentrating the lines in different area to create lights and darks. But instead of using cross-hatching, I kind of use the scribble method, and I'll show you how that works. So I'm going to start just by outlining the shapes that I made. In the center of my succulent. And I'm going to continue to do that all the way out to the edge until they are all outlined. They're connected and they have a weird shape. That's actually probably for the better. And once I've outlined everything, I'm going to stop there for the interest of time. I take my pen and just really lightly start sort of scribbling inside the white spaces. So I'm not eliminating them completely. I'm just darkening the center of my plant. And again, I would build it from the middle. I could even add a little bit of texture to these leaves if I wanted to by using a combination of lines like that, and just kind of keep building outward. In a succulent like this, you're going to have your darkest area in the center. And then also some details around the edges. So that's what that would look like on the edge. And you would continue to build out and build out until you have something like that. Now I'm going to check the chat. Okay, so there are two questions. Where do I go to get inspiration? Really, the internet is amazing, but also if you're bored and you want to just stop by like the garden center of Lowe's or Home Depot, there's a really great selection, and just snap a few photos, like close up. I'm sure no one will care. That is, you know, if you feel like getting out of the house. If you don't, I usually will just start to Google like watercolor succulents, watercolor cactus, and I'll just Google image search them and really click through like hundreds of different images, and I'll start to pull out the ones that I like. And then I will kind of go from there, because there are a lot of watercolor succulents available, mostly because of Pinterest. I think it's a really popular decor thing. And also, if you type in watercolor succulents or watercolor cactus into the YouTube search engine, there are some really good painters out there that'll show you different techniques similar to mine. The shapes will be the same for the most part, but that's a really great place to look. Also, Pinterest obviously is awesome for that. I tend to be a person who Googles everything, so I mean, Google. But also, nature is best. If you can paint from nature, that is always the best way. That was what was really pounded into my head when I was in school, that if you can paint from life, painting from life is the best thing to do, but that is not always possible. So we have to make adjustments. Other than that, the other question that I had was when something was drying out. Let's see. When you say lines on the paddle, do you mean lines on your paintbrush or lines on the pan of paint that you're, or lines on your actual succulent? No, she's gone. Okay, well, really water can fix most problems. Either water or blotting can fix most problems when it comes to watercolor. As always, if you have any questions, you can reach me at uart.tamu.edu under the staff contact section. If you need a recording of this session, contact Abby Roy from Flourish. Otherwise, thank you all so much for coming and participating this week. Next week, we will be doing a silhouette landscape. That'll be the last in the series of watercolor, and then we transition to a mixed media class through Flourish. So there will be more classes weekly. So I hope you have all a great afternoon, and somebody emailed me their example from last week. If you have photos, please email them to me. I appreciate them so much, and they're great for us to share both with Flourish and with the University Art Galleries. So everyone have a great afternoon, and I will hopefully speak to you next week when we do our landscapes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen.